Battling against the forces of darkness is the most perennial fantasy activity. When you stand shoulder to shoulder with your friends against evil, that's pretty much as peak fantasy role-playing as it gets. But for every epic clash and massive confrontation against the forces of darkness, there's a lingering question. Who's paying for it? What happens if you're broke? If you got zip, zilch, nada? What happens if you are like broke? Well, my friends, that's where you have to engage in a little bit of fantasy Moneyball. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, I am the Dork, and that makes you fine folks the Desk, and you're watching Desks and Dorks. We bring you indie tabletop content. If you're watching this video, a like and a subscribe would go a long way as we continue our march to 20k subscribers, and if you're on mobile, hyping this is the single best way to let the algorithm know that you love this content. But with that out of the way, what are we going to discuss today? And first of all, we have to talk a little bit about what is Moneyball. So what is Moneyball? You see, it actually is centered on the story of one Billy Beane, at the time the manager for the Oakland Athletics, a Major League Baseball team here in the United States. See, Billy had a bit of an issue. Despite his best efforts, the Oakland Athletics were basically dead broke in terms of American baseball teams, and they were unable to field a competitive roster. So Billy turned to statistics. Using math, he was able to find players with the best on-base percentages, players who could contribute to the gaps in his team, but most importantly, players that everyone else had overlooked through traditional scouting, which meant he could get absolute champions for basically nothing. And this formula paid off in spades, and Billy was able to take this misfit team on a World Series run. Now, they didn't win the World Series. I don't even think they made the World Series. But in response to this sudden change, it altered the fundamental landscape of how baseball was played. And now, in modern baseball, pretty much every team uses some combination of the analytics that Billy Beane and the Oakland Athletics used, in addition to traditional scouting. It was such a big force, it became the source for a tell-all book, a fantastic bestseller, and a fantastic sports drama starring Brad Pitt. If you've never watched Moneyball, I would highly encourage you to do so. It is pretty freaking awesome. But basically, the TLDR is Moneyball is the idea of getting something for nothing. So where does that bring us? Just like Billy Beane made a championship team out of scrap parts, misfits, and the outcasts of baseball society, we are going to make the greatest champion group of heroes, the mercenaries, the adventurers, the guys who are going to take on the Dark Lord, and we are going to do it for pennies. And I mean that term loosely. Heroes is going to be in quotes for a lot of this because, you know, when you don't have a treasury, you're going to have to get desperate. This is a thought experiment, a world-building exercise. You can think of me as your trusted advisor as you build your army to battle darkness, and we sit there and we cut coupons in order to be able to afford our armor. But I think this is going to be a fun one, so buckle up, buckaroos. Let's play medieval Moneyball. First, we have to start with the basis, recruiting and training. All right, a couple things right out of the way. The greatest warriors of all time, we absolutely positively cannot afford them. Mighty paladins of order and justice, nope, absolutely out of the budget, can't do that either. Cringe anime heroes with plot armor for days, nope. Also out of our budget because that would, require us to buy Truck-kun to hit them and have them isekai'd to our world. Can't do that either. So, if you own land, if you have a family name, or let's be real here for a second, a future at all, you are not with us. We have to start with that one and rip that band-aid off first. Just like the Oakland Athletics, we are not going to be able to afford anybody with any real game. So, who are we going after? Why are we recruiting them? Let's start with the obvious ones. We are going after prisoners. Yep. I am emptying every fantasy jail in the nation, or at least the ones that I am pretty sure will not destroy us, right? We are going to war prisoners, we're going to ransomed knights, we are going to basically anybody who looks like they can swing an axe or wield a sword, and we are being like, hey buddy, you guys want to get out of jail and maybe fight the Dark Overlord? What do you think? Pretty good idea, right?
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
Yeah, but no, seriously, there's a reason that, like, several different members of the crusading armies during the Crusades were people who were hoping to get a pardon from God. Ironically enough, the first crusade is the one that succeeded, and that had a lot of those people, right? There's a couple reasons we're going to do this. One, they are cheap. Most fantasy kingdoms, unfortunately, like most Western nations, at least this one, don't seem to care too much about the safety of their prisoners, which means, in a lot of cases, we are the best option for them. And that means, hey, if they can get out of their jail cells and potentially get a better sentence or no sentence at all, they might be willing to help us fight evil. So that means, cool, we're gonna do that. It also means that we can afford to pay them through looting. Now, if you have watched the channel in any way, shape, or form, you'll know that I have talked about looting and its importance to the construction of medieval militaries several different times. It was the main way that armies were paid in the Middle Ages, and thus the basis of fantasy. However, even armies in the Middle Ages still paid their warriors a monthly salary, usually based on their skills. So if you were really, really good at something, you could expect to get more money. Or if you were someone who had a particularly great combat skill, you could definitely get paid a lot more. For example, men-at-arms who provided their own armor, or longbowmen who had that fantastic range and accuracy, could expect to be paid more than your standard conscripted soldier, or even one who had been with the army for a longer period of time. This is in addition to the looting. However, because they're prisoners, they're just getting loot. That's the main way that we are going to pay them. And again, this is really important when any single one of our warriors could wind up as fertilizer on a battlefield at any given moment. And we really do need to discuss the idea of a pardon. Using conscripted prisoners to fight in combat is actually not a new phenomenon in human history, nor is it a unique one, nor is it even a historical one, right? This actually does happen quite a bit, particularly when countries are on their last legs, or when they know there is an opportunity to be taken advantage of, and they don't necessarily have the manpower to do it. And again, if we're going to be playing Fantasy Moneyball, if I'm going to be going up against the Dark Lords, I want to have every advantage I can get. And again, because our resources are limited, I'm going to have to take advantage of this. And before you're saying, hey, there's no way that would happen in a fantasy world, or hey, there's no way that would even happen now, need I remind you that we actually have convicts fighting forest fires, like right now, and we pay them basically nothing. And they still do it because it helps reduce their sentence. Also, because the American prison industrial complex is awful. Anyway, moving back to medieval Moneyball, let's talk about the next group of people that we're going to be working with, and that is peasants and serfs. One of the reasons that there are so many individuals willing to be conscripted is that there's not a lot of opportunity, particularly if your farms keep getting burned down by evil goblins. And so, we will be targeting some of the peasants and the serfs, the individuals who, let's face it, don't have a ton of prospects and might be willing to risk their lives fighting for the chance at something better. We're going to particularly be going for individuals with skill sets like these longbowmen right here. One of the things that you'll learn as you study history is that, for example, a lot of the things that become specialized military tact were, in fact, at one point, things that peasants actually did in their regular lives. So, for example, the English longbowmen are derivatives of the Welsh longbowmen, which are in fact derivatives of the individuals that would hunt, gather, and scout in their own native lands. And so we're looking for people who are trackers, we're looking for yeomen, we're looking for hardy people with good forest craft skills, we're looking for basically anyone with a transferable combat ability that they might have actually gained from their daily life. And we're going to tie that all up with a 6-year contract period. That's right, you're going to sign on, and at the end of those 6 years, you can take home whatever loot you've got, and if you're one of our prisoners, leave with a pardon, or if you're a serf, leave with the ability to travel wherever you like. Either way, you make it through 6 years of our campaigns, and you leave a free individual. And I think that lure is going to attract a lot of folks, especially if we're going to have to battle the Dark Overlord, because we're going to need to attract a lot of folks. We're going to be splitting this time into 2 parts. Your first 3 years are in active combat, duking it out with the forces of evil. Look, if it's the apocalypse, I'm going to need every single soldier I have on the front lines. And really and truly, that's the best way to gain the kind of experience that you're going to need to bring victory back to our borders. However, in order to keep costs low, those last 3 years are going to be spent in training and combat support, right? Part of an army's strength and part of the thing that's going to keep you from having to restock it and thus spend more money is its veterans. And we are going to use our veterans and shift them to active support roles and leadership roles. That way they can continue to train our new forces and recruits and pass on the knowledge and tactics that they have learned and gained over those 6-year period. You make it to the end of those 3 years, you're going to be absolutely fantastic. But finally, if you want to stay, because let's be real here, right? Imagine you're a serf or a prisoner and you've spent 6 years in our new company. I don't know what the name of our company is going to be. Tell you what, the best name in the comments gets it. You can name the company My Mercenary Company. Why not? But basically, after the end of those 6 years, we will offer you a salary to remain on. This way, if there are people with legitimate skills that we want to maintain, we can offer them a competitive salary after we know they're going to work out and after we know that their skills are still going to be of use to our mercenary company fighting against evil, right? So we've managed to maintain our knowledge base, to continue to train our soldiers. We're paying them with loot, which we just take from our enemies. All of this helps us to keep costs as low as humanly possible. Which begs the question, how are we paying for all of this? Well, I'd like to introduce you to something called the loot cycle, because here's the thing, fallen warriors take no loot, and after a massive clash, when all is said and done, the surviving members of our company will get their cut. However, we, the mercenary company itself, or the adventuring company itself, will also take a cut of the loot, and if you are gone, guess what? You don't get any loot. Because we're going to be operating as a relatively smaller group, right? This is going to be kind of an adventuring party or small mercenary company, maybe a medium mercenary company. We don't necessarily have to invest as heavily into supply chain or supply lines. Thus, we can forage, which helps us having to engage too much with food or the pack animals and necessary costs associated with continuing to maintain an army at that logistical level. Again, helps us keep the costs low. And if we can just scavenge and find the stuff from the outside world as our war bands manage to fight against evil, you know what? I'm all for it. And again, looting costs also allow us, allow us to keep equipment even lower, right? We can manage to maintain our army, or at least our group, by taking the weapons and armor from others. We can sell armor we can't use, or adapt weapons that we find on the battlefield to help us out. And actually, this is really true for how medieval armies, especially lower equipped ones, would have worked historically, right? You can upgrade your equipment a lot of times from the fallen, and we have accounts both in Italy and in places like what would have been the Czech Republic, where regular soldiers, run-of-the-mill soldiers, essentially have massive windfalls overnight, getting new equipment from fallen enemies, and it winds up turning their fortunes over basically instantly. We're going to be taking advantage of that. This constant cycle of keeping food costs low, equipment costs low, and taking a cut of the profits ourselves when our soldiers are no longer able to, allows us to continue to play the game of fantasy Moneyball. Lastly, I just want to say a quick word about using land. Land is not loot, right? But the value of land itself is critically important to our campaign, particularly if a lot of folks have been destroyed and are unable to reclaim that land. That arable land becomes part of the payment for our officers and those that we're using to train, because it doesn't require us to pay anything, right? We manage to get that back as part of our contracts with whatever king or queen or ruling council we're serving, and it means that people are going to be loyal to us long after it is done, right? We want stability, and what better way to do it than by making them warriors who serve alongside us, landowners. Give them some stability. The Romans did it, the Americans did it, heck, pretty much every major military that had some square yardage to spare and needed warriors for their conflicts did it. And I think we're going to do it here to help us defray the costs of playing the game of fantasy Moneyball. And this brings us to equipment. As you can imagine from our wonderful cadre of peasants and doomed prisoners, we are not going to be buying things at fair market price. Our equipment is going to look either like an Orc War Boss table or like some of the most scuffed things that you could see from Trench Crusade. So essentially, we're just going to try to retrofit as much as we can, and what new equipment we're going to get is going to be basic but effective, which brings us to the spear. This is the first thing and probably the main weapon of our contingent. Why? Because they're incredible. Spears, or the classic pointy stick boy strategy, is one of the most effective things in human military history. If you stick a big pointy stick in between you and somebody else, chances are you've got a chance to beat it. We can use this against cavalry or to cordon off areas. We can use this defensively or offensively, and spears can even be used as ranged weapons. There's a number of incredible reasons that we're going to use this weapon, and let's be real for a second, it's pretty effective in general. We don't have to be giant Spartan warriors to make this stuff work. First of all, they are cheap. They are dirt cheap. Now again, we could make a really nice spear like these particular ones with some of the bells and whistles, a spiked point at the other end so that you could set it for cavalry charges, or points along the haft to stop people from sliding swords up their shaft, that kind of thing. But let's be real for a second, if we can just go into the woods and find sharp sticks, that's pretty effective. We can use that as a spear. So they're relatively cheap, even if we do wind to making like a decent spear type, right? We don't have to spend a ton of money to do it, and that's really going to be important because we're going to have to arm a lot of folks. They are, as I mentioned, incredibly effective. They're useful against cavalry, they're useful defensively, and the medieval world was dominated by a position called the skilltron, which is kind of like a lesser version of a phalanx, but it's far more mobile, which means we can actually move across terrain faster, or even uneven terrain, which the phalanx traditionally struggled with. And again, super helpful for us. It's really going to be helpful because for later on, we're going to talk about the lack of armor that our guys are going to have. So keeping the enemy at bay lets us keep more people alive and thus have to recruit less people, thus allowing us to continue to play medieval Moneyball. Yay, spears. Spears are great. Now, the other really important thing is it takes no time to train with a spear. You can get to a base level of competency with a spear in a pretty short amount of time. Seriously, it's one of the reasons that it was used by peasant levies, militias, and defense groups pretty much throughout human history and is still relatively effective even today, which means that we can spend even less money on training and less time on training, and as we all know, time is money. Money is power, and power is pizza. So the less time that I can spend getting someone ready with a actual training regimen through spear combat, it means the more money that we get to save. And that is pretty great when I'm going to be throwing our entire company into the medieval meat grinder as they fight against the forces of evil. Alright, so we covered spears. Now let's talk a little bit about ranged combat. Now there's a lot of reasons we need ranged combat. I talked about throwing the spears, but let's be real for a second. Sometimes, just like the classic 80s rock song, you gotta reach out and touch somebody. And I don't know about y'all, bows and arrows are actually kind of expensive. And more importantly, the training of individuals with bows and arrows is equally time expensive and also just monetarily expensive, which means that things like crossbows or longbows, those wonderful little ranged battalion kind of things, yeah, we're not gonna have access to those. Again, we're playing Fantasy Moneyball, so that means that I'm going to be bereft of some of the most potent weapons imaginable. However, there is the standard weapon of bandits and also of the Roman legion. I am talking about the same kind of weapon that laid out Goliath. That's right, my dear friends. The humble sling. From historical accounts, not only was the sling really cheap to make and use, you could use standardized bullets, which is exactly what you would call the ammunition for the sling, but you could just use regular rocks. In addition to being inexpensive to make, it was also relatively easy to train on, particularly if you were firing in mass. This means that as long as I have enough people slinging rocks downrange, I am going to be able to do some serious damage to some unprepared adversaries. This makes it ideal for our soldiers because, again, we don't exactly have the time, wealth, or money to do the kind of things that we would like to do, and once we have a couple experienced slingers, it should be relatively easy to help train some of our additional warriors, at least to a basic level of competency. I'm not looking for David here. I don't need anyone going out and 1v1ing Goliath when, after the giant Philistine says, hey, I want the smoke. I just need enough of us to get massed in one area that we're going to cause some damage. And I think that's something that we can do pretty applicably. As historical accounts of those slings from the Roman legion, there were some barbarian tribes that were more afraid of fighting the legion in ranged combat because of the slings than there were legions or barbarian tribes, I should say, being afraid of fighting them in hand-to-hand combat. Lastly, I do need to cover armor because I do have to provide some base level of protection to my recruits. If I am just sending people literally into the meat grinder, I am not going to have a lot of people left to do or left to work with. So let's start with the basics. A shield is the single most important piece of equipment that we can use. We can use to protect us from ranged weapons so we can get close enough to use our slings, and obviously we're going to use it when we're close enough to engage in combat. It's a great complement to our spears. I have to have a medium to large size shield, and again, a lot of advantages to the shield because I'm able to do it for pretty cheap depending on the material. Helmet. Do need to provide a helmet for my soldiers. I have to protect the skull, the cranium. That is critical as well. Have to make sure that I have some form of helmet or helm protection. And last but certainly not least, other than the helmet, nothing. Just sheer nothing. You get a helmet, a shield, a spear, and a sling. Welcome to medieval Moneyball, boys. This is what we're using to survive. If you want some better armor, go scavenge it from the corpse of one of your enemies. And now, we're going to get into tactics, but before we do, I do have to say a couple messages from our sponsors. This video is sponsored by us. If you would like to support Desks and Dorks and the work that we do, $10 a month on Patreon gets you one of our unique role-playing games every single month, and the entire backlog of Desks and Dorks RPGs. I think right now we're at like 9 or 10 in total, so there's a lot of good value there if you want it. You can also, of course, get PDFs from itch.io if you would like digital ones. You can use the link to Dice Nest to get unique handcrafted dice, and a percentage of that purchase actually just goes to support us over here at the channel. And if you want physical copies of any of the games that Desks and Dorks has created, you can get them from our partners over at Indie Press Revolution if you want physical copies delivered right to your home. With that out of the way, let's talk exactly about tactics. So we have to talk a lot about tactics because how we fight is going to be just as important as the weapons we use to fight and the people that we fight with. First up and out of the way is the full frontal charge. It is a terrible idea for our group, not least of which because we're not fully trained, at least not in the way that most traditional militaries are. Our weapons and armor tend to be a lot lighter than many of the enemy companies that we are against, and a full frontal assault, although it might look cool in stories or in movies, in television programs, it is the purview of the well-armored and the well-trained. And unfortunately, at least to start, that is sure as heck not going to be us. So the frontal assault is right out of the way. Instead, we're going to do a lot of ambushing. And the lighter armor and lighter equipment of our soldiers actually makes that easier for us. We can move faster with our longer reach weapons and the slings that we've got. We can manage to actually take out unprepared opponents fairly quickly and fairly easily. And because our soldiers have a lot to gain and nothing to lose, I should say, it allows us to make better use of the terrain and heavily aggressive tactics throughout this entire time. The ambush is, frankly speaking, absolutely ideal for groups such as ourselves. And there's a lot of weapons that we can use to do with them. We already talked about the use of slings and spears, but our throwing spear could be a potentially useful thing too. That's to say nothing about being able to dig in trenches, traps, or defensive positions and use our long reach and our, not better morale, but our chance at getting better loot as a wonderful way of inspiring us to continue to fight long after it is no longer viable for our enemies. And lastly, I do think we need to address something I like to call the special sauce. The little things that help make our really unscrupulous band of mercenaries, adventurers, and ne'er-do-wells turned heroes something special. And the first one is the training, right? I know I've already mentioned this before, but our veterans are going to be put on a plan, right? It's not like they're just going to take all of that wonderful knowledge and then leave once they are grizzled and potentially useful to the cause. I want to keep them loyal, I want to keep them in the Legion, and I want to keep them working for our adventuring company, mercenary band, roving group of marauders, whatever you want to call us, right? And so again, we talked about that 6-year contract, but realistically, those last 3 years of training and deployment are spent training their replacement. And I know I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I do think it's critical. One of the things that actually gets neglected in the modern workforce is that many times companies don't have a, shall we say, a succession plan for key or critical roles within their own supply chain. This is actually something I studied pretty closely when I was working in a corporate education office, and there was basically a not influx, but what do I want to say here? 3, 2, 1. A diaspora of middle managers, essentially middle level officials, middle level workers essentially within this corporate structure, and that resulted in a ton of wasted productivity. The upper levels of management didn't have anybody to communicate to people who were new what their new missions or their new objectives were, and myself and many of the people who had just begun in the organization really struggled to get our footing. This cost the company an exorbitant amount of time and money, and that's the reason that I have our workers, our soldiers essentially, spending their last 3 years literally training the person who's going to replace them. I would like to avoid the brain drain and the accompanying loss of time and money that goes with it, and I think that training is essential to help us play medieval Moneyball the way that we are going to do it. Another thing that I think of that's pretty interesting is that there's tons of magic weapons and armor in a fantasy world, or even in a low fantasy one. When we're fighting against the forces of darkness, there's a very real chance we'll come upon some sort of artifact or weapon or potion, what have you. So what do we do with these immense treasures? How do we take these artifacts, and what do we have to change with these incredible items of immense power? Well, my friends, we're going to give some to our soldiers. We're going to give some to the best of the best, the elite of the elite, our hardened veterans, the ones who have stuck it out for a while so that they can continue to be successful on missions. However, the truth is, we're going to take a lot of that stuff and we're going to start to develop it and backwards engineer it ourselves. My goal by the end of this is to become a kind of magical Lockheed Martin, a Bose Allen of lightning bolts and fireballs. If I am able to reverse engineer even some of the magic that we bring back, even if it's lesser, we can then begin to use it and implement it on scale or sell it to the highest bidder. And I do think that matters. And with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of today's video. Again, if you'd like to support us, $10 a month on Patreon or a $3 a month YouTube membership. Our PDFs can be found at itch.io. Dice Nest if you would like fantastic dice, and Indie Press Revolution if you would like physical copies of our games. But lastly, I have to thank the amazing people who give me the consistency and the time to continue to do these things and to make the kind of videos that I love making. So a huge thank you to Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Kavadi, Alex.vksh, Solution, Stefan Brissot, Brian, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Smer, Darth, Arcane Bard, Commander Unidentified, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Carl Agius, David Z, Michael Torres, Chalath, Varalder, Cadme, Ashley Smith, Cheris, Blood Sparrow, and my amazing YouTube members Agile Monk, Joshua Williams, Artemis, Samuel Putnam, Seralder, Chandler Dwyer, Hatsus, Up Up, Down Down, Left Right, Jacob, Krebo, Tebby Boy, Brody Stumpf, Ryan D, Thunderdash, Gaming Gambison, Franco, Dried Squid, R1X, Israel Joiner 6186, Komai Watermelon, Ignacio ZS, Joshua Zoller 9573, and Two Lives. Without you all, I wouldn't be able to do this, so thank you. You are all absolutely amazing, and all of you watching are absolutely amazing. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.